Hi everybody, thank you for joining us for our webinar today, our Talk Creative webinar called Pricing Your Worth. And we are going to be talking about the way that we can help students understand pricing of their creative work, whether that's an artwork or it might be video editing, etc., all different types of creative work. And I'm joined today by some great guests. We have 4 people joining us today who have got lots of different stories and lots of different interests. And Alamelu, who is our student voice today, is going to be asking the panelists questions when they come up. And so we're just going to generally talk about how we price work and advice and guidance for students when they're thinking about freelancing. So I'm going to hand over and introduce our guests. And I think we'll start first with Lucy Phillips. Lucy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Lucy. So another Lucy, work with Lucy Turner on Brooks Creative as project officer. And alongside that, I work as an associate lecturer within the School of Arts at Brooks. And I've spent the past 5 academic years working with fine art students on their professional experience modules. I'll hand over to Helen.
Hi, I'm Helen Slater-Stokes. I make glass sculpture from my workshop here. I make work for gallery, public and private, commission, and also for collections. And in my part-time, I have a little tiny bit of that. I do some teaching at De Montfort University as well on the design crafts degree in the glass department.
Brilliant, thanks Helen. Alec.
Hi, my name's Alec. I run a platform called Intern, which is geared at helping to empower young creative people to build their dream careers. So over the years, we've run a number of workshops and sessions about just this topic, amongst others. So trying to help people to price their work effectively.
Brilliant. And Alamele, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Alamelu. I am a recent graduate of MFA Fine Art at Brooks, and I'm a student assistant for the Brooks Creative.
Amazing, thank you. So we decided when thinking about how to talk about this subject, but we might just sort of introduce the ways in which we've all worked independently, freelance, etc., and reasons why we did it and the difficulties with sort of money management, I guess. So I'll just give you quickly my experience of going freelance. Was I was frustrated. I was a frustrated fashion designer on the high street, didn't like what I was doing, felt stifled, and I got a sort of approached by a company to work freelance for them, and I took it. And I loved it and it was really great, but had no idea what to do in terms of when a job came in, how much to price for it. I'd not been taught it at uni, hadn't got any experience at it, couldn't find. Back then there was probably not as much internet as there is now, so haven't got the functionality of Google to do a search, any of that, so it was just winging it. And I think it's a really good opportunity to cover this subject today with us, all of us, sort of giving different insights. Helen, how about you?
Well, I was always going to be freelance, if you like, or working independently as a maker, having studied at degree level and then MA level in glass. And I suppose there was a little bit of coverage, maybe, like you. It was pre-internet, my degree. Students are horrified when I say I have to go to the library and look things up rather than go on Google. So it was a kind of a steep learning curve, I think, from those starting points. I hadn't taken everything into consideration, certainly, and my pricings when I first started were lower than they should have been, really. But that's kind of a learning curve. You realise, actually, when I work it all out, I'm not making any money on this, and I'm not then having the money to put into new work. So things change, and luckily the work evolves, and so you can start to make those changes. And obviously, as you become more established, you can increase that price point as well in relationship to your knowledge and expertise and the familiarity with the market, really. So yeah, it was a bit of a bumpy start, I think, from my degree and my MA when I first started out. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. How about you, Alec?
So, I mean, I studied sociology at university, graduated into a recession, and worked in bars for a while, kind of fearful of making a decision on what I'd do for the rest of my life. It felt very kind of very kind of set in stone back in the olden days when I graduated. So I was always putting things off a little bit, but eventually I got interested in independent publishing. And when I looked for a route in, the only thing that I could see was internships. And this is back before it was a kind of an established thing in the British lexicon, certainly. So I guess through my experiences of that, I found that many, if not most at the time, were unpaid. And that made kind of going freelance both a kind of necessity because there wasn't the paid work in the field. And also, I think like both of you have said, a bit of a trial by fire exercise. So I didn't really know what the going rates were. I had to kind of either learn that through experience or just ask people in this kind of little community and hope that they were being straightforward with me. And of course, the longer you are in the game, the more you're able to look back and go, that wasn't strictly true, was it? But thanks anyway. So
Yeah. How about you, Lucy? From your perspective, what's your experience?
Yeah, so I've got kind of two different insights, which can be quite interesting. So the like you, Alec, graduated in the recession, really exciting times, filled with such enthusiasm, and then got out into the real world. But I went after sort of studying fine art, I went down the arts management route, so for me, kind of, I guess like this portfolio career or sort of working freelance is more about like services rather than a product as an artist. So I'm kind of coming from that perspective, but also as a lecturer working with students, it's really interesting to hear their perspective on things. And I think that question always comes up about almost wanting a magic formula when we talk about pricing our work and our services. And as we're going to explore today, there's unfortunately no one thing, but it's about identifying the approaches that work for you and having context of what others are doing and what the industry is looking like. But yeah, it's one of the questions that comes up kind of time and time again.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there isn't one single answer in terms of how we do it, and it does depend on the context within which you're working. And I think, if we think about models of pricing, there's all different styles, isn't there? Whether it's hourly, daily, project-based, etc. So I think I always found it difficult myself to do an hourly rate because I would worry that it would take me longer because I was new to what an expert would take. So then I would be more expensive because I would take longer. And, so all of that sort of came into my head, and I was always trying to undersell. I almost undersold myself because I was worried I would take longer than the next person to do something if I used an hourly rate. But then I think if you use a daily rate or a project rate, you've also got to take in how many hours you take to do something. So I don't know, what different models do you use for pricing?
I think if I could just quickly, before we go into the models, just because with each of these there's often like an opposite point as well. So your anxiety, which I'm sure a lot of people share, I certainly have in the past, is that hourly rate, if you're not too good, it will take you longer, it will end up costing the client more. The inverse of that is if you're great at what you do, you basically get punished for it.
Yeah, true.
Which is madness, which is obviously how it, in any, you take that out of the creative industries, people would fall about laughing at the prospect that somebody with all this experience, with all this expertise, could basically get, make nothing because they're effective at doing their job. There's a really good Paula Scher quote, graphic designer, that comes back to an anecdote, that comes back to an identity she did for, I think, Citibank in the US, one of the big kind of, corporate banks. And the story famously goes that they had the primary meeting over, some fancy Mad Men style lunch somewhere in downtown Manhattan. And as the execs or the Citibank execs were talking to her, she was working away and she sketched out what ended up being the kind of umbrella logo that Citibank still use today, the kind of, at least the bare bones of it.
Mm.
And she was like, there you go, that's it. And she wasn't saying it in kind of like solved it, done it, fine. But that was part of I think and this is decades ago now, that was part of a multi-million-pound branding project. And again, those executives in that context, so it's not even like it only happens in the beginning of your career. This is two people working for a multinational corporation looking across the table at one of the most respected, famous graphic designers on the planet going, are you kidding me? We're paying you like millions and you're just going to sit here and do it. And I think I'm gonna fumble the quote now, but it's something on the lines of, you're not paying for this 3 minutes, you're paying for the 30 plus years of experience that allow me to filter what you're saying and kind of put it into something like that. So as always with these things, wherever there's an anxiety, if you kind of try and flip it the other way, you'll also see an absurdity. So sometimes that can help to quell some of your anxieties. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, I wouldn't want anyone who's very senior to punish themselves because they can do it so fast. So if we think about pricing models, then what are the different aspects that you take into consideration, Helen, when you're pricing work?
So I've got several things that I look at. So I have to look at overheads first. I've got workshop, so I have to take into consideration the workshop costs in terms of rent, utilities, insurance, business insurance, and business rates. So that's kind of what I put into my overheads box, if you like, and I can work that down to a day rate or a week rate that I need to add in to my total. Then I go into material costs. So that individual piece that I'm making, how much glass am I using, how much firing time. So everything that goes into it is a material base, but also all the consumables that you forget about. So the bits of polishing grit, the bits of paper that I need for that, the liner for the kiln, all that has to go in and be costed up. And I also double up there on my electrical costs because I put in the firing cost again. And that's because I'm looking after my kilns and thinking about repair and renewal. So I have to have a budget, a contingency for anything that goes wrong, if elements go, etc. So I'm doing that. Then it's wages. So I think this is something we'll come across anyway as we're talking, but working out what do I want to earn an hour and how many hours has it taken me to do that. And then I usually add in a 10% profit on that, which again is my self-development money. So 10% on the final price that I come to, and that goes back into redeveloping work and also any kind of programs I want to do in terms of self-development. So once I've done all that, I'll get a figure for that individual piece. Then obviously I need to think, okay, this is going into gallery. They're going to put their commission on it. Most of them are between 30 and 50% commission. London is now 50 plus VAT for galleries there. And I then offer parity across the country. So I standardize all my pricing to a retail price for that piece. So if that piece shows in Edinburgh or in London, it is the same price because we're too small a country to have any kind of disparity between price costs. And I don't want buyers contacting me saying I bought a piece in London and now I've gone to Edinburgh and it's cheaper. So standardizing that is really key. And also thinking about if I'm selling direct for commissioned work, it has to be comparable to the gallery price. So I don't sell for what gallery asks for, which is artist price. And I never give them an artist price. I give them a retail price and that's it. So that I get that consistency and that the galleries don't feel undercut, because galleries will blackball you if you start selling direct and it's similar work to what they're showing in gallery. I mean, I make individual pieces, so they would never be identical, but that is something you have to be careful about, definitely. So making sure I've got that retail price correct, it is going to cover all my costs and give me something to put back into the business. And then however that goes out, whether it's to gallery or to private sale direct, it's the same price.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think, when you look at different ways of pricing an actual item, the material costs and all of that kind of thing, it's clear to us, isn't it, that that's what we need to cover. And I think for me, I found it difficult when it was actually a service that I was doing, and I remember one job I had to design supporters merchandise for Everton Football Club. I was like, I have no idea what to charge here. And, that different type of work then becomes a little bit more challenging in terms of, oh, crikey, what do I charge for this project? So, Alec, I don't know if you've got any tips or advice on that kind of aspect of pricing.
Well, I think it opens the door, at least for, and I guess I have a question for Helen as well off the back of this. One other way, so I guess we've kind of very lightly covered the idea of like an hourly rate or a daily rate, and then kind of a project rate or like a set fee for something. The other kind of realm that we can go into, which some people aren't very keen on, and I don't mean to sound dismissive there, because it's a whole new ball game, but the idea of value pricing. So I guess in the context of what Helen was talking about, it would take that model and it would pose the question that if, say, I don't know, the little bit we know about me, if I went to Helen for a commission, and I don't know, I'm trying to think of somebody who's incredibly wealthy but not repugnant that Helen would still clearly do business with, and I'm coming up short, unfortunately. I don't know, the Obamas come and commission something really rather similar. And there's no right or wrong answer here, I'm certainly not trying to set any traps, but would you, Helen, would you charge me the same as you charge them potentially? Or would there be an opportunity there to kind of bump it up a little bit, considering
I would charge you the same, to be fair, but I do work in a bracket which I call perceived value when I'm talking about pieces that have taken a long time to develop in terms of design and failed attempts, etc., etc. So it's not the actual piece that goes out the door is worth X, but actually it's X plus the last 6 years research and development of that idea and progression of that idea. So if it was exactly the same thing that you wanted, you would both get the same bill. But I see what you're saying in terms of you can very simply say, oh, it's this much material, then I can pare it all down and this is what it's worth. And that's your kind of standby, pricing. But then there is that perceived value of something. And as you become more established and as you start to show in higher end galleries and the work becomes more developed, you start to have to charge for that experience and that knowledge. And then obviously that's reflected in your hourly rate. So that goes up. But then there's also that idea of research and context. So thinking about, in that high-end gallery, what is the average price point and where would my work sit in that world? So yeah, it starts to shift then. Obviously, that's a very basic model that I discussed in terms of the fundamentals to make sure you stay afloat.
Yeah, of course.
But after that, you've got to then start to think, hang on, this work has got to develop and it's got to move forward. And so with that, it jumps into different categories and different gallery rates, etc. So it starts to build price point wise. Yeah.
And I think this is where going back to Lucy's example of Everton Football Club, sometimes and drawing on something that Lucy Phillips mentioned earlier, this kind of idea of it doesn't apply to everyone, but in some cases, certainly when we start out, the kind of go-to, because it's the easiest and it feels the most familiar and safe, is to sell our creativity as a product. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a physical product, but we see it as a thing, a finite, boxed off, whether it's a set of files or it's an object. And when you start thinking about productivity as a service, which may or may not apply well to what you do, the way I like to think about it is that rate can go from being quite fixed if it's a product to being really rather elastic if it's a service, because then you're starting to talk about a series of intangibles. I suppose they are tangible, but they're very kind of flexible things. So it might be that, say, Lucy, you got that that brief from Everton, and initially the scope was it's 12 garments. What's the price for a range? Okay, fine. So you could go away and you could calculate that. If they get a sense through that project that they're really enjoying working with you, well, they're liking what they're seeing, they've actually got sign off from, you know, somebody senior, which is always how these things go when you work with big clients. There's the person you're speaking to, and then there's a dozen other buggers who you never meet who start to, you know, who are really pulling the strings. But say they then go, okay, well, we'd like to double it, we'd like to treble it. It's not necessarily, I would hope, or at least there's an opportunity there to not just necessarily double the rate as the number of garments increase, but there's a lot more going on there. There's how much value you're kind of adding to them. If you're producing an entire range for a Premier League football club, you know, these are some of the biggest in terms of like generating cash, like retail businesses in the country. They're global brands. So you have to start, you know, doing a few little bits for them is maybe one thing. But the moment that starts to become a far more substantive project, it's not just the time that you're necessarily dedicating to that, which isn't neatly going to multiply anyway. It's all the other things that come with that. It's handling the I sat in a really, because I'm not sitting here claiming that I'm the finished product and I'm the fountain of all knowledge on this stuff. I sat in a webinar a few months ago with a consultant in New York who basically said, and it was glorious, it was so nice to hear somebody say it, that her price, whenever she's working with corporate clients, the number of people who she's in contact with on the client side, the moment that gets above one, she adds money onto the fee, because the practical implications of that is it's just more conversations you're having to have, and more mixed messages that stop you from doing work, backtrack. Oh, it's got to be this way, it's got to be that way. That just it creates, as the person trying to fulfill that service or create that product, it makes your process far more inefficient. So all things like that you can start to factor in, so that it almost on a project to project basis, then it could be that the outcome is relatively similar. But if I only have to be in contact with one person, we can sit down, we can have a meeting quite easily, we can define the brief clearly, we can draw up the contract, we go away and we do it. That's fine. To produce the same output for like 5 or 6 people who are all shouting on top of one another is a totally different ball game. So there's lots of things that might alter that price potentially. And I think when you start to, even if it's not your default setting or it necessarily fits with what you do, it can be interesting to just try and imagine if it were a service and you were kind of accounting for all the interactions, and on top, I guess, of all the material things that Helen was talking about, that's work. Going out and winning the work is part of the work. That's a developmental cost. And often when we're working for ourselves, we fall into the trap of only charging for the time when we're actually making the thing. And that's killer, because any freelancer will tell you that you're not working 30 days a month. You're, you know, if half of that is actually making stuff, you're doing phenomenally. And depending on the nature of the industry you're in or your specialism, the amount of time that you have to spend reaching out to potential clients, trying to win work, conversing with clients, thinking about where you're going to share and exhibit work, working on self-promotion, taking care of your website, all the other things that come with turning you from an individual into a functioning business. That's all stuff that ultimately you need to be accounting for when you're charging. So I think we always get lost, particularly when we're starting out, in just that here and now. Anything that you're doing to do with creating that output is absolutely something that ultimately you should be factoring into your billing.
Yeah, you're so right, because I was just having this conversation the other day with somebody about you know, a salaried job is this much an hour, and is it worth stopping freelancing to go into a salaried job, because actually, you know, at least you get a fixed income and etc. etc. So they're having that debate with themselves: is it going to be worth me stopping what I'm doing and going into a salaried job, or continuing what I'm doing? And I think you can't necessarily compare the two very easily, because like you say, you've got to, your hourly rate as a freelancer has to take in all of those other things. So you might not work 37.5 hours a week at that price and charge somebody that price, but you need to know what it is you want to earn, and then break that hourly rate down in terms of, well, I think I'll probably do 15 hours of actual invoiced time. So if I'm doing that, I still need to earn that amount, you know. So in terms of the calculations you do, it'll be quite a different calculation than just dividing a a £30,000 a year salary into 37.5 hours a day per week. So yeah, it is really difficult, and I think it's having the confidence as a new freelancer creative to actually consider those things and know that somebody actually wants to pay that for you. And yeah, we had a discussion, didn't we, beforehand, in terms of thinking about what you should charge, but actually being worried because you wouldn't pay that for yourself. And I think that for me is another thing that it takes a lot of confidence and a lot of guts for somebody to kind of, especially someone who's new, to feel really confident that they would be worth that. And Helen, you had a really nice story the other day when you said when you talk to students in terms of negotiating with somebody, you said about standing in front of a mirror.
Yeah, I usually say to my degree students before their degree shows open, because obviously the buying public come in and want to buy something and assume it'll be a cheap something because it's, you know, a degree show, so they're looking for a bargain really. And it's making them confident enough to stand by their price point that they've worked out and confidently say, yeah, it's £500 or it's £800. So I used to make them stand in front of the mirror beforehand and say it and look at themselves and sort of smile as they're saying it, rather than saying, oh, well, it's really expensive and it takes a lot of work, and this backing up that students do away from the kind of having to say the price. So I said, be confident about your pricing. If a buyer gets a sense that you wobble on that pricing, they'll go for it. There are lots of people that want a bargain in the world, and they'll pick and pick and pick until they get it. And if they walk away, they walk away. But the bottom line is you make that work, and only you make that work. So nobody else is going to have that. And if they want it, they go to you, and that's the price that you want for it.
Yeah.
So, you know, let them walk away. They may come back.
Yeah. And that is the other thing, having confidence that you can let somebody walk away, because quite often you sort of pick a price because you desperately want the money and you desperately need the money and you don't want to lose a customer, but actually having the confidence to say no because that customer's not right for you, because clearly they don't value what you do. And that's a really difficult one. You know, the first customers you take on, how can you be confident enough to say, well, that's what I'm charging. If you're not prepared to pay it, that's fine. I won't work for you, when you've got bills to pay or whatever and all of that kind of thing. So that's really tough, isn't it?
And it is interesting because if you price incorrectly and you price too low, it won't sell either. People assume because it's a lesser price, it can't be as good as X or Y that they've seen. It's not high quality. You know, I've had glass students ask, is it made of resin? Because it's so cheap. And it's like, well, you know, so it's a very, very fine art to balance it and get that sweet spot that says it's a quality item, but it is something that's a little bit more expensive than perhaps you thought. You know, to have that slight intake of breath when you give them the price. But I think if you go the other way, then it's a real hiding to nothing, because those collectors will look at it in a what's wrong with it way, rather than that's something I'd like.
I think also being really aware of the disservice that you can do to the industry of underselling yourself as well. And I remember going to a studio visit as a second year, and the studio manager gave the tour and, you know, talked about what they did. And this piece of advice just has stuck with me all these years. And it was basically, if you're underselling yourself, you know, it's as tempting as it is to sell a painting for 50 quid as a student. If you think of the knock-on effect that that's having to the creatives that are working professionally in the industry that you're going to graduate into, and you're not just sort of doing a disservice to yourself eventually long term, but also how we operate as an industry. So I think just having that at the back of your mind as well, and thinking of that being a creative as a sort of collective.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, that whole debate of when should you work for free as well. We've got an article that one of our students wrote about that. And when something is like, oh, it's good for your CV, and it's something that Brooks Creative are really keen to avoid any student having to make those decisions, because we do insist that the projects we advertise as much as possible are paid projects. There's still people who want, because they don't necessarily have a budget, because they might be a non-profit organisation or whatever, they are asking for things for free. But also we get people asking for internships and they're not going to pay the student until 12 weeks in, because they want to see how the student gets on, and then, you know, 12 weeks, after 12 weeks they say, oh, thank you, goodbye. You know, it's really not, it's the creative industries sort of the negative side, I think, of the creative industries. And it's not necessarily the actual industry, it's people who use the services of the industry as well, who are expecting, especially students, to work for very little or nothing because they think they need it on their CV. And I think you have to, as a student, weigh up the pros and cons as well of that. And we talked about with students, you know, reflecting your own values in the people that you work for, and being able to work for companies who you think are ethically sound, that you know, support your opinions on climate change, that support your opinions on all those other things. And I think that's another element to it. Alameda, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to know in terms of say pricing older work, because as an artist, when you create a lot of work and then you have no storage space, because we're starting to, when you do not have space, how do you, if you're going to do, for example, if you're going to do like a more of a sale or a clearance sale, how would you go about pricing that? And would that cause problems with works that you've priced higher?
Good question.
I mean, I find, sorry,
Helen, you go.
I find with older work that I still have a few things that I kind of sentimentally kept, I suppose. I had a sale when I moved workshops, so I legitimized it by saying I was moving to another workshop space, didn't want to take all the other stuff with me. I confirmed that with my galleries, and that was fine. It wasn't similar to the work that I was stocking them with, so that was, you know, it wasn't a clash in that respect. And I've also sold older work through solo shows where I've had a wider body of work on display. And so obviously it kind of fits in the timeline of the work that was on display as kind of almost a retrospective of what happened to that point. So that's how I've gotten around it. But luckily with glass, if I make a lot of stuff and I hate it because it's really old, or I didn't like it when I made it and it never goes out, I melt it down again. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
What about you, Alec? You were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, it totally depends on the context, but a lot of the time when it comes to, like, I guess, age of work, I'd ask the question, do you even need to tell people when it was made? Does it matter? Is that like intrinsic to its value? And I'm not suggesting anyone be dishonest, but again, you're the not only the creator of the work, but you're also the architect of the narrative around it. That's part of being creative. So as Helen gave the example there of it's a you know, a moving studio, we're having a clear out. There's everything in the language you use there, the way you frame it sets the tone of what the expectation is around the value, the same way that if you drop those prices incredibly low, then, I mean, you start to kind of like a magnet, you start to draw in all the bargain hunters, which are not the kind of people you want badgering you for work regularly anyway. And two, you kind of, it's almost like, oh God, I see this all the time with like, you know, when say like furniture goes on sale and they're like 40% off. And I'm kind of like, if you have a 40% off sale half of the year, who's going to pay full price for it? So it's always that kind of it's ultimately up to you how you seek to control that. You could start selling on a different platform through a different means. Maybe explore that as a way of in your mind, clearing out the work, but to a new audience, it's work they've perhaps not seen before. So I think it's you know, it's without knowing anything about your art, it's kind of hard to, you know, make any. I certainly wouldn't want to make like, you know, clear recommendations what to do and not to do. But again, I think one thing we sometimes lose sight of as creatives is that when it comes to pricing, we can be creative there. When it comes to how we talk about our work, again, we're in control of that. It's a blank canvas until we make a decision and until we put it out there. And one of the upsides to this digital world we live in is that we can control a lot of that narrative. It can get taken out of context and people can, you know, try and kind of challenge that, but we can usually open a web editor and go, oh, today it's 900 quid. Tomorrow it might be 1,500. It's, you know, it is up to you ultimately.
Yeah. I just had another follow-up question in terms of pricing it for different audiences. For example, I work mainly with painting, and a lot of my pieces were created in India. And now when I bring it over here and I see that the prices are very different, how do I find a balance between that? And yeah, that's basically the question.
Are the pieces, is the going rate in the UK higher or lower than?
Much higher.
Sell it at the higher rate.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's no like, you should never apologize for what, like, entering at market value. If this is the market you're selling to, that's what they're expecting anyway. There's again, it's not really, you can choose to make that them being produced in India as like a value point, or you can feel like maybe it takes value away. I would sell it as a value point. You know, if people, all kinds of things that people might, and this is kind of obviously doesn't really apply to art, but in terms of like most other products and things, people would say, oh, authenticity. It's made in India, and I can access it here in the UK. Like that's a great bonus. It makes a piece of work maybe more unique, harder to get hold of, and collectible. So I try and focus on the positives whenever you can. And it's not about, if you feel that these kind of narratives you're coming up with are dishonest or you're uncomfortable with them, don't go ahead. But I think, again, it's like there's a lot with creativity. The value is, for a large part, is what someone's prepared to pay for it. And we had this discussion last week when we had a little meetup before this session. And I think, Lucy, you mentioned a time when somebody told you to double your price and see what happened.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, I think that was just, it keeps coming back to a confidence thing, doesn't it? So this was for actually using space. So it was kind of, you know, selling a service in that way. And as an artist-led kind of organization, I was used to working on really small scale projects and working with artists and wanting to provide accessible space for them to realize their projects. And then when it came to sort of being approached by commercial companies who were wanting to use space for kind of film shoots and film sets, I just didn't have a clue where to sort of pitch that, because I didn't have that experience. And someone in the industry kind of just looked at my price and just said, just double it. And I said, I can't possibly double it. But actually, he'd kind of given me the confidence to take that approach. And like I said to you last week, you know, when I did finally give that price over, they didn't bat an eyelid at that anyway. So he kind of, and I think it's these life experiences as well, isn't it, that will kind of affect your journey, and you'll learn from each kind of interaction that you have with a client. But yeah, I do think as time goes by, you know, really building on that confidence to not undersell yourself, to know your worth.
I think definitely that for the question that Alamelu asked in terms of market value, I think what you have to decide is, are you selling to the world, or are you selling to a particular market in the UK? And I think you kind of need to make decisions on where work is being sold and who your customers are, because I have a very good friend who's into marketing, and she was like, you've got to sell to your dream customer. That's who you're marketing yourself to. So who is your dream customer? Who's going to spend the money that you need in order to survive? Because if it's, you know, someone who wants a portrait of their pet, you know, and they want to spend 50 quid, that's not your dream customer. Your dream customer is the person who sees the value in what you do, and you have to market yourself to that level, and then that is where you put your price. And I think you know, if you're trying to sell work in India and in the UK, they're two different sets of customers, so you will then have to think about two different markets. So, you know, where are you at now? What is your focus? Where do you want to be? Who is your dream customer? And that's who you need to be speaking to through your marketing, through the choice of platform that you use to sell, through the, you know, potential galleries that you might work for, or through the exhibitions that you tend to work into. And I think that is an important aspect of that kind of question, in terms of, I've got these two different price points and how do I make it work? That's what I would see as being an important aspect. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay. And we've had a question from our audience. So this person is thinking about commissions and any specific advice about commissions, because artist calls for submissions are often for low fees. So how do you make that work if your practice is in that context rather than in retail? Any advice, guys?
I would say for commissions, for me, I'm careful which commissions I go for. Ensure that the commissions that you're going for do pay you for a design fee for proposals. So you're not just spending hours and hours putting stuff together, sending it in, and don't get paid, don't get anything. Some will ask you to put an initial proposal in, and then they'll pay you to develop that, maybe one of 4 that have been selected as they narrow the field. And that's fine. But be very strict with yourself with those kind of commissions, and make sure that if you're putting a proposal together and you think, oh yeah, I really like that job, say, I'm going to allow myself 2 hours to sit and do design work for that, and that's it. Don't spend weeks and days and what have you putting together something you think is amazing just to have it submitted and not be selected. You know, you've got to kind of be very strict with your time with these things. So be careful which commissions you're going for. Ensure that there is a development fee at least when you've put your initial submission in, if you're selected. And then a little bit like Alec was saying about commissions in general and working in projects like that where it's a larger scale outcome, you know, the pricing has to involve meetings, it has to involve emails, it has to involve, you know, meeting with the site manager when you're putting an installation in. So all those things, rather than just saying, oh, this is the sculpture that I'm going to put in place and it'll be this much, you know, a massive contingency has to be put in for your travel time, petrol to site, backward and forward, all those things that have to happen. So yeah, I mean, with commissioning, the price points for me are very different in that it is almost a double it scenario, because when you're working on large projects, there's always something goes wrong. It always takes more time than you think. There's always extra costs that get thrown in. And I think as well, there's an expectation with larger projects, a bit like you were saying about the Everton football strip, that the price point is going to be, you know, in quite a high bracket because of the kudos of that particular job, the size of the job, etc. So yeah, that's my advice for commissioned work. Certainly be careful which ones you go for, and when you do put any kind of pricing in, offer a big contingency that covers meetings and travel and all those extra things that come up.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with Helen there in terms of being being picky and also being wary of a free pitching process. That's another thing that I won't get on my soapbox, because luckily we got the whole unpaid internship we kind of broke away from that before I got really angry. But free pitching is another kind of across all areas of the creative industries. It's a process. Do whatever you can to not get sucked into, because it's absolutely brutal. When it comes to artists' calls, I'd be very, very, very selective. And if you're at the start of your career, these things can look really, phenomenal. If it means you get to go abroad on like a residency and it's going to be a group show, and there's there's a lot of benefit to that in terms of building your profile as an artist. But be selective. So maybe, restrict how many you even apply to per year, let alone successfully go to, because the process of application, as Helen says, it's always more drawn out and complicated than you hope or expect. Sometimes it will be just a very brief, send us a written proposal. Sometimes it goes through stage after stage and they want developed ideas and this, that, and the other. And if they then turn around and either say no, or even more commonly go, well, we said the budget for this was this. It actually turns out we've crammed more people in than we intended to because everyone's ideas were so good. And now that your slice of the pie is smaller. And it then means that your proposal that you put together, they still expect the thing and you're expected to take the hit out of your end. And it happens all the time. And I hate to be a cynic, but often the smaller, more interesting looking, particularly when you're an early career artist, those events, they're chaos. Because the people who are organizing them are just finding their feet as well. And they've got all the good intention, but they've not necessarily got the processes in place to deal with what's going to happen, which is it's chaos. Trying to get even a dozen artists to all be to deliver work in one place somewhere in the world on time, on budget in 2022, like it's really really difficult. So I would just I'd give yourself a however long it usually takes you to put these together, whether they're successful, whether they're not, kind of factor those things in and just restrict it a little bit. If you get one or two, I mean, I think I applied for, I've applied for like Arts Council funding at least 3 times. I've never got it. That process, if you've ever done that,
Me too.
oh my God, you just want to like pull your brain out through your eyes by the end of it. It's deliberately obfuscating and frustrating because it has to be, because otherwise everyone would have a go. So they try and sometimes they try and grind you down. And then I'd pretty much given up on ever asking anyone for any money. I'll just go and do it myself instead. And then I got an Adobe commission, which there's never in a million years. I just threw it in last minute. There's no way they'll go for this. It's absolute rubbish. Is the one that came off. So you also there's no, unfortunately as well, I think was alluded to at the start, there is no magic formula for any of these things, because at the end of the day, it's a totally different individual or small group of people reading these emails, looking at the PDFs every single time. So one, I think, unfortunate reality of freelancing generally is just when you think you've cracked it, you've got your product nailed down, people know it, understand it, you're communicating it well, you found your audience, you think you're sorted. The moment you inhale, ready for a long yogic exhale, it all goes pear-shaped, generally speaking. So you factor the rise and fall, the success and failure into it. And again, the longer you're in the game, the more experience you get, the more times you get burned, somebody tells you something's going to happen, it doesn't happen, the more you'll start to ultimately factor that into your pricing. Your pricing will creep up. And as Helen was saying before, that way you're covered. A kiln breaks, it's fine. It's fine. I've incrementally been, putting this money aside, and the single thing that stops that ends freelance careers quicker than any other is failure to factor that into pricing, failure to put aside the money for a rainy day, because there will be one and another one and another one. So it sounds really crass and it sounds overly simplistic, but just that if you change anything off the back of watching this, just try putting your prices up a little bit and see how it goes, because I can guarantee you that will give you a little bit more wriggle room than you had before. And if you, over time, if you continue to do that, you'll be able to work on bigger stuff, you'll be able to take on more interesting things with a bit of a foundation behind you that you maybe didn't have before. And usually what separates successful freelancers from people who aren't is not necessarily quality of work, it's pricing things so that they can afford to develop and learn all the things that you have to learn, and not just hone the craft of the creative output, but also the craft of selling that and running it as a business, which is hard, but it takes time. So you're just buying yourself time by pricing a lot more aggressively than you might be doing at the minute.
And I think as artists and creatives, it's difficult, isn't it, if you don't feel like you've got a business head, because actually quite a lot of your time is thinking business things, as well as producing all the lovely artwork and creative stuff and design work that you've got. It is also the kind of money management, the admin, all of that kind of thing also is a really important element to be conscious of. And I think in this question where you're saying I work in commissioned artwork and they're often low fees, it's like you perhaps could diversify and think about different ways of making money from your abilities and your skills and the things that you do. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go full retail. I don't know whether anyone's heard of beingfreelance.com. So beingfreelance.com is a platform, a website, and they have a podcast series, and it's run by Steve Frolland, and he's done 300 interviews with freelancers on podcasts. They are brilliant, and they are a whole range of different freelancers, like a sound designer, a copywriter, a pay-per-click consultant, like all sorts of things. But each one has got a different story to tell on how they price and how they get work. And it just gives you it gives you a little bit of background into ways in which you could operate according to what your situation is and how you do things. And I know one of them this week that I've listened to is a graphic designer, and they have really honed who they work with because of the time that they've taken to say, actually, no, I don't like designing boring manuals, or I don't like designing these catalog things. I really like working with bright, fun stuff. So I'm only going to populate my website with all of that bright, fun stuff. So that gives people looking at my work, wanting to know whether it's someone they should work with, the idea that this is the sort of thing I do, and I've really got a signature now. And it does all come with time. But I think if you, we were talking to another student, weren't we, Lucy, on the weekend, who is an installation, his work is installation, immersive technology and all that kind of thing. And he's like, how do I make any money from that? Because it's not a tangible thing, and it's not a this and it's not that. And I said, really you should be considering ways in which you could enter the kind of events space and working with kind of events and organizations that use sound and light in different ways, and supporting your professional practice, your own practice as an artist can be supported in lots of different diverse ways than just producing that artwork and that's all you're going to do. And because that actually can be quite difficult. So like Helen, you do other things like teaching and talks and things like that, don't you? And there are different ways. Go on.
Lots of ways. I mean, when I started out, I didn't initially just say I'm going to start selling work. I lived in London. I left university in debt. And so I temped, and I temped in a lot of IT departments, interestingly, all with software packages that covered payroll. And so I did that for about a year. And then I got a job working with another artist for the year and a half. And then I went back to the payroll software and got a job with a company, totally blagged it, but a job working as the head of payroll because they had a new software package that they didn't know how to work that I touched upon at another company. And so I ran their system parallel to their existing system until the new software merged in. And I worked for them for a further 7 years part-time. And I cut back as my business got bigger. I cut back the days there, and became the main IT consultant for that department, and just kept on stepping back. And that allowed me to have the time to do my own work, build that, and earn the money that I could put back into that business and start to build that as well. So yeah, I think there are lots of skills as graduates that students have that they can take into different areas. And I think the key thing when I did all that temping work was to say to myself, I am an artist and I will do it. And when people ask me, what do you do? I didn't say I work in an IT department. I said I'm an artist, and held on to that. And I think that determination to do that whilst trying to earn the money to be able to do that was what kept me going and made me focus on getting where I am, really. So I think it's fine to have those two strands and have that support as you get started as well, and that where you can charge more for your work perhaps and take a bit of a risk and not feel you're desperate to sell it because you need the money, and that does you favors in both aspects, doesn't it? Because then your work is sitting in a better level, and even if it doesn't sell at that show, it may sell at the next one, but you've still got an income to support you.
Yeah, and I think our question in the Q&A section is, this artist is working with universities to respond to research, and I think I've got experience of working with our public engagement network, and they do really struggle for money to communicate their research, their science research, in different ways with creatives. It's a project that we've currently started looking at and working with students, but their research is often funded by research grants, and they could have money in that research grant that goes to public engagement, but they don't often have a lot of money for that. And I think an artist that I don't know whether you know, called Anna Dimitriou, she works with scientists. She's an artist in residence at the John Radcliffe in Oxford. She's worked with scientists from Leeds University, Brighton University, also all sorts, and she's had quite a successful career as an artist because she's very, very connected to the research that those scientists are doing, and they see the value in what their collaboration is. So they will put in funding bids together jointly, which then enables her to do things. So I think it's the way that you build that relationship with the universities and the scientists that are working there, because I think there are ways to operate as an artist working with a researcher, but it depends on their research grants and how they're applying for them and what money they are saying in a research grant is going to go towards that. So if you are building up a relationship with university researchers, then it needs to be a sort of mutually valuable proposition. And that's something that I saw Anna Dimitriou in a webinar a couple of weeks ago. And I asked the question, how do you form those strong relationships between the scientist and artist? And she was saying it needs to be of mutual benefit. Actually, no, it was the scientist. You have to see the value mutually in what each other can bring to that relationship and leave preconceived ideas at the door. It's all about dialogue and conversation. So I think it's that building of that relationship and being part of the actual initial grant application for research that then allows you to sort of have more say in terms of the fee that you want to charge. I don't know if that's any help at all. So I think we're coming up to the hour now. Well, actually, we've gone past it. It's 4:05. So I think we've kind of covered everything we wanted to say. And I don't know if anyone's got any final remarks or anything that they would like to, any kind of top tips, advice to artists, creatives looking at ways of starting out with their pricing that they want to share before we go.
I suppose for me, I would a couple of things I'd say is one, just like be kind to yourself, because nobody's got it cracked straight away. Two, anytime people like us tell you to like jack your prices up, we're also aware that like that's a pretty nerve-inducing feeling as well. Just like if somebody just says you go and double it, like that's scary. So that's totally normal as well. I would just to go back to what Helen said at the start, understand as clear as you can what it costs to be you, what it costs to do what you do. And rather than pricing on feeling, on what you think something is worth as an object or a service, understand what it costs to create that service. And that as an absolute bare minimum baseline will probably shock you, because it will probably be more than you've been charging so far. That's fine. The people who run successful businesses or have successful freelance careers do not go any lower than that. And that's not to say if you see, you want to help a mate out on a project, or there's a local charity that you want to support, that's your choice too. But it's far easier to make those choices if you've got a sustainable income. And the only way you'll get that sustainable income is really sitting down and doing the maths and ensuring that you're not undervaluing yourself at every turn, because that way you could do 50 commissions a month and barely pay your electricity bills. Nobody can live like that, and it's just not feasible. So it's boring, but sit down, do the maths. If nothing else, if you're still just figuring out what is it you want to do as a freelancer, how much does it cost to be you? If you were gonna have the comfortable salaried job that would allow you to pay all your bills, live in a relatively comfortable existence. We're not talking, doing all your food shops at Waitrose, but just like being able to go out and have a meal now and again. Figure that out. What's that? How does that break down? How many projects are you realistically going to do per month? What does that look like? And again, the figure that you see might be quite scary, but that's the bare minimum. So once you get past that imposter syndrome feeling, which usually will happen after you send your price and somebody's like, yeah, fine, you're like, all this time I've been charging 1/10 of this, and this was fine all along. Happens to everyone. So it's a process. You'll get there, and by watching something like this, hopefully you'll get there a tiny bit quicker. So keep going, you'll be sound.
Brilliant. Thank you. Helen, have you got anything to
add? Really, just the whole thing about being confident about your prices, as Alec just said. And remembering that it's only you that makes the work. So if they want that piece of your work or that design or that idea, it's unique to you. So have the confidence to say it's worth this much. They're not going to go around the corner and get it from somebody else. If they want it, they have to come to you. So that's why it's that price.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, and just a quick one on that, because it's something that particularly in graphic design, illustration, happens all the time, is a client will go, oh, well, they do really want to work with you, but such and such said they could do it for this amount. You just go, well, why don't you go to them then?
Yeah.
Why did you come to me? If their price is so good and they're so great at it, why come to me if I'm more expensive? And a lot of the time then you kind of get to the root of it. They either want the cheapest thing or they want the good thing. And again, it can sometimes, and it's not always possible, to turn down the work. If you're in a tight spot financially, you might have to take it. That's totally fine as well. I don't think anyone here is saying just, always, no matter what, put the foot down, even if it means you starve. But sometimes if you just twist it on people and go, well, bugger off then. Yeah. Don't waste any more of my time. It's billable. I'll send you an invoice if somebody else I know does like, what is it? First 15 minutes, or first 10 minutes of a meeting are free. After that, it's billed at like an hourly rate, and it's an aggressive one. They don't get, people are a lot more selective when it comes to meetings, and it helps them to filter out a lot of time wasters, which initially you can feel like you've shot yourself in the foot a little bit. Yeah. Those aren't the type of people you want to be entertaining. You want the serious folks. So
yeah, great advice, guys. Great advice. Have we got any more questions from our
I can just add, actually, some interesting things came out in that, and we could spend another hour talking about this, but I think it's really worth noting about actually how art is valued in terms of the external factors that we have no control over. And that's historically, like talking about gender, art pay gap, and a whole load of other kind of factors that, as much as we can say our work is of this value, there are factors out there that will affect that. And I think being aware of that and doing your bit within the industry to kind of challenge those practices, to diversify artists that are exhibiting and selling work, is really important, to take responsibility for that where we can. And there's a really good podcast I recommend. It's one of the Radio 4 Seriously series, and it was back in August, but it talks specifically about female artists and the difference of their work selling, and it's really, really shocking. But there's also some positives about people out there who are kind of making things change, hopefully. But yeah, just being aware of the environmental, societal sort of context that you are selling in. And I guess, like you said, Alec, be kind on yourself, because there will be a whole load of factors that actually you don't have control over.
If it makes anyone feel any better, I once went through a period of about 6 months where I was sending out proposals to potential clients, and I wasn't getting a thing back. I rewrote the email 4 or 5 times, or loads of soul searching, this, that, the other. I thought it was end days, and I accidentally sent one of the emails from like a personal account and got a bounce back straight away. And I was like, I'd been on an email blacklist for 6 months. I had no idea. So I got no work through I was relying then on like repeat custom that was already established. I hadn't got a clue. And you know, if I think I was probably about a week away from going bust. You know what I mean? It could have quite easily gone another way. So there'll always be something. You're only like, when you're working freelance, you're one person. The world's dead complex, full of lunatics, and all kinds of things can go wrong. So again, yeah, just be kind to yourself. And it's so much easier to talk to other people who are trying to do a bit of something as well. They don't have to be the same specialism as you. Anyone who's trying to run their own business, you know, the war stories they'll have, it's great. And it's like, if you can just save a little bit of time and pain learning from other people's experiences as well, and feeding back into that as well, you know, actively being part of a community where you help one another figure all this out together, it's so much easier than going it on your own. That's like a superhuman effort, and the people who are successful are both superhuman in terms of the effort they've managed to muster, but they're also incredibly lucky because things have just, you know, the right opportunity, the right time. You can't, you know, unless you're into reading tea leaves and all of that stuff, there's, you know, there's probably not much you can do to control it. And if you view the world like I do, there's pretty much nothing you can do to control it. So the only thing you can do, I guess, to positively influence it is just try and keep yourself in the mix, try and have conversations, try and go to events, meet people. You'll inevitably get dragged along to a few things that you regret, or that, you know, are a waste of time, or a few blind alleys. But if you ask, you know, you might just find out something that really helps you.
And there's lots of communities actually for freelancers. So the Being Freelance community is on Facebook. I think there's several thousand in there. And then there's, you know, lots of different communities online, which is a really great thing. Thank you, Alamelu, for coming. That's a really great thing about the digital world now, is actually you can connect with so many more people than you could ever do before. And there is lots of communities out there that are freelancers who just want to help each other and just support each other. And I think that's a really nice thing that's, you know, in this digital world, you can connect with people that are in the same situation as you, especially if you're feeling a bit despondent over things and not quite sure whether you should carry on, or you just need a pep talk from somebody. There generally is, you know, a community out there that you can join in with that will do that. So brilliant. So thank you everybody for being part of our webinar, and thank you to Alamelu, who's had to go back to work now. And thank you to the questions in the chat. I hope you've had your questions answered. If not, you can follow up by going to I think we put the websites for everybody in the chat. So have a look in there to see if there's anyone you want to follow up with. But otherwise, it just is a huge thank you from Brooks Creative to you guys for being here and giving your insight and advice. And it's been really, really interesting. So thank you. And we shall see you all soon in our next Talk Creative webinar.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, bye.
Good luck.